Hello, family. Welcome to Stories with Madezi. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also, share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The market bustled with the usual symphony of voices, traders yelling out prices, children giggling, wheelbarrows rattling on uneven ground. Valerie clutched her son Clyde's small hand tightly as they navigated through the crowd, her other hand balancing a modest shopping basket. It was one of the few Saturdays she had managed to scrape together enough money for a full home-cooked meal, and she was determined to make it special. Clyde, who had just turned 6, tugged at her hand with excitement as they passed a stand selling groundnuts, his eyes wide. "Mommy, can we get some?" he asked, hope twinkling in his tone. Valerie smiled, even though her heart sank at the thought of spending beyond the tight budget she had calculated down to the last naira. "Let's see what we have left after the tomatoes, okay?" she replied gently. She had always been good at hiding her struggles from Clyde. That was her strength, masking storms with smiles. Just as they reached the vegetables section, a familiar voice slithered into her ears like poison. "Valerie, wow, life's been humble to you." She turned around slowly, her breath catching. There stood Jesse, the man who had once promised her forever and abandoned her while she carried their unborn child. His arm was lazily draped around the waist of a woman Valerie instantly recognized, Mildred, the same woman who had once laughed behind her back during her pregnancy. Mildred's gaze slithered up and down Valerie's simple appearance, from the faded wrapper she wore to the frayed edge of her scarf. "You're still coming to this market?" "No delivery apps yet," she said mockingly. Jesse's eyes settled on Clyde, and with a smirk he whispered loudly, "So that's the bastard I left behind." The words hit Valerie like stones. Clyde looked up, confused. "Mommy, what does that mean?" he asked innocently. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her chest ached, not from the insult, but from the realization that Jesse still had the power to humiliate her in public. She gathered Clyde in her arms, blinked away the sting in her eyes, and said with forced composure, "Let's go, baby. We have nothing to prove here." But inside, something cracked, and from that fracture, something fierce began to rise. The next morning felt heavier than usual. Valerie sat silently by the window as soft rays of dawn spilled across the concrete floor of their modest apartment. Clyde was still asleep, curled up with one arm over his favorite storybook. The image should have filled her with warmth, but all she could hear was Jesse's voice echoing in her head. "That's the bastard I left behind." The word haunted her. It wasn't just the cruelty, it was the way it slipped so casually from Jesse's mouth, as if her son were a stain he was proud to mock. Valerie had spent 6 years trying to protect Clyde from that kind of hate, yet it had found them anyway. She stood up slowly and walked to the mirror, examining herself. Not for vanity, but for answers. Had she really looked that pitiful in Jesse's eyes? Was that why he left so easily, so shamelessly? She shook the thoughts off like dust, then moved to the kitchen and began quietly preparing breakfast, her mind already racing on how to make Clyde's day brighter. The boy deserved joy, not shadows. Later that afternoon, as they sat on a bench near the community playground, Clyde suddenly turned to her with the kind of quiet seriousness that only children mastered when their innocence had been slightly bruised. "Mommy, what does bastard mean?" The question dropped between them like glass shattering on tile. Valerie's fingers stiffened around the plastic container of jollof rice she'd packed for them. She forced a breath, blinked slowly, and placed the container down. "It's a very ugly word, baby," she began carefully. "Some people use it when they want to be mean, especially when they don't know the truth." Clyde frowned, his small lips pouting. "But he said it like it was about me. Am I not real?" She pulled him close, placing his head gently on her lap. "Clyde, you are more real than anyone I know. You are loved, and you are mine. That makes you everything." Clyde nodded slowly, but the flicker of confusion hadn't left his eyes. Valerie stared out across the swings and slides and vowed silently, "One day you won't just be mine, you'll be seen, respected, and claimed in full light." By nightfall, the apartment was quiet, save for the ticking wall clock and the hum of a nearby generator. Valerie sat at the small dining table, sorting through a crumpled envelope of unpaid bills and notices. Each slip of paper felt like a slap, a reminder of how far behind she was despite how hard she tried. Her thoughts drifted to her younger self, the girl who had once walked into Jesse's arms with trust, never suspecting he'd let her fall. When she found out she was pregnant, she remembered the night she told him. Jesse hadn't raised his voice. He didn't curse. He just looked her dead in the eyes and said, "This isn't in my plan. Handle it." Then he'd walked out of the apartment they once shared and never looked back. She remembered clinging to the bathroom sink that night, vomiting from a mix of heartbreak and hormones, her cries muffled by the whir of the bathroom fan. And now, 6 years later, she was still picking up pieces he'd never had the decency to acknowledge he broke. As she folded the final bill and placed it back into the envelope, Clyde shuffled out of the room, rubbing his eyes. "I had a dream," he mumbled. She opened her arms, and he walked straight into them. "What did you see?" she asked softly. "That you had wings, and you were flying with me on your back." Her heart ached at the purity of it. "Maybe that means we'll fly out of here one day," she said, planting a kiss on his forehead. "We'll get somewhere higher, somewhere safe." He nodded sleepily. "With cake?" She chuckled, brushing her fingers through his hair. "Yes, baby, with cake." As he fell asleep in her arms, Valerie stared at the peeling wall ahead of her. She didn't know how or when, but the storm wouldn't last forever. She had survived the heartbreak, the whispers, the empty crib, and she was still standing. Bruised, yes, but unshakably alive. And her son? He would never see himself through Jesse's eyes again. Dressed in her neatly pressed blue blouse and brown skirt, Valerie held Clyde's hand as they stepped through the gates of a well-rated private school on the city's outskirts. She had heard they offered scholarships to academically promising students and hoped Clyde's playful brilliance would earn him a chance. The receptionist barely looked up from her phone as Valerie approached the desk. "Good morning," Valerie began with a hopeful smile. "I'm here to ask about your admissions process and scholarship opportunities for Primary 1. The woman looked up, her eyes taking in Valerie's outfit, Clyde's well-worn sandals, and the plain bag she carried. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, her voice laced with condescension. Valerie's smile faltered. "I read on your website that you accept applications throughout the term." The receptionist shrugged and handed her a form with exaggerated disinterest. "Fill that. But I'll tell you now, it's competitive. Most of our parents, well, they don't look like you." Valerie's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. She led Clyde to a small plastic chair and began filling out the form, her hands trembling slightly. "Mommy, are we going to this school?" Clyde whispered excitedly. She forced another smile. "We'll try, sweetheart, we'll try." As she handed in the completed form, another parent walked in, a woman in designer heels with a son wearing branded clothes. The receptionist's tone transformed immediately. Warm, welcoming, helpful. Valerie stood there, invisible. "You'll hear from us, eventually," the receptionist muttered before waving her off. Outside the school gates, Valerie knelt beside Clyde. "Listen to me. No matter what happens, you're just as good, better even, than anyone in that classroom." Clyde looked at her seriously. "I know, Mommy. 'Cause I'm yours." Her throat tightened. "That's right. And one day, they'll know it too." As they walked away, Valerie made a silent vow. Her son would not grow up watching doors close in his face simply because of who wasn't standing beside them. It was a humid Thursday afternoon when Valerie heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving too confidently in their narrow street. She peeked out through her curtain just in time to see a sleek, cherry-red Mercedes pull up a few houses down. The windows rolled down, and Jesse's loud laughter spilled into the air like smoke. Mildred was in the passenger seat, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, her acrylic nails tapping against her phone as if the entire world needed to know she was unbothered. The car was too shiny for the dusty street, the air too smug for their modest neighborhood. Valerie instinctively pulled the curtain back and turned away, but it was too late. Jesse had seen her. A few minutes later, she heard heavy footsteps outside her door, followed by a knock that felt more like a taunt. When she opened it, Jesse was standing there with a grin that hadn't aged a day, though now it held more arrogance than charm. "Wow, you still live here?" he said, his eyes sweeping across her small veranda. "Life really sat you down, didn't it?" Valerie didn't answer. Clyde had come to the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of the stranger. Jesse glanced at him briefly and scoffed. "Still dragging that boy around like a handbag?" He laughed at his own joke before continuing. "You know, Mildred and I just bought a duplex in Guarimpa. You should visit. Or not. I'm not sure they allow single mothers in the estate." Mildred's voice chimed in from the car. "Babe, leave the poor thing. She's clearly doing her best. Besides, I'm sure the boy has a bright future. Selling plantains at the junction, maybe." That one cut deep. Valerie clenched her fists, not from shame, but rage she could not afford to express. Clyde looked between them, puzzled. "Who are they, Mommy?" he asked. "Nobody," she said firmly, ushering him back inside. "Just people who lost their way a long time ago." As she shut the door and leaned against it, the laughter from outside faded into the hum of her thoughts. That visit wasn't just a mockery, it was a warning. Jesse didn't just want to move on. He wanted to rub his version of success in her face. Clyde's 6th birthday arrived on a quiet Saturday morning, the sun peeking in gently through thin curtains as the boy sat up on his mattress with a grin, expecting little but still excited. "Happy birthday, my love," Valerie whispered, kissing his forehead. "Are we having cake?" Clyde asked hopefully. Valerie hesitated, then smiled faintly. "We're having something even better, a birthday dance in our socks, and a surprise meal." She'd spent the previous night boiling rice and frying tiny chunks of meat she managed to bargain for at the market. There was no money for cake, but she did find a pack of powdered drink mix, which she chilled in an old bottle to make it feel special. As the day passed, Valerie tried to keep the energy high, playing music from an old Bluetooth speaker while they danced across the cracked tiles of their small sitting room. Clyde laughed with joy, his legs clumsy but free, and in those moments the scarcity melted away into something purer, happiness born from presence, not possessions. Later in the evening, just as Valerie lit a matchstick to warm leftovers, a soft knock came at the door. It was Mama Tenny, their elderly neighbor, holding a cluster of balloons in one hand and a plastic bag in the other. "I saw your boy playing alone this morning," she said softly. "Children should feel special on their birthday." She handed over the bag. Inside was a small marble cake, slightly lopsided but lovingly baked. Valerie felt her throat tighten. "Mama, you didn't have to," the woman raised a hand. "No child should grow up thinking he's forgotten. And no mother should think she's invisible." Clyde's eyes sparkled as Valerie lit the single candle Mama Tenny had stuck into the frosting. "Make a wish," she whispered. Clyde closed his eyes tightly, then blew. As the flame vanished, Valerie wrapped him in her arms, whispering in her heart, "One day I'll give you a birthday with everything, cake, guests, gifts, and joy so loud it echoes." But for tonight, this quiet joy was enough. Rain fell in thin, stubborn lines that Saturday morning as Valerie stood outside the silver gate of D'Souza Global Ltd., her worn-out folder pressed against her chest beneath a black plastic bag. She had printed her resume at a cyber cafe 2 streets away and double-checked the company's address thrice before leaving home. This interview wasn't just a job opportunity, it was hope itself knocking. As she stepped inside, the receptionist glanced at her water-stained skirt with a faint sneer. "You're soaked," the woman said. "Should I tell HR to cancel?" Valerie straightened her spine. "No, ma'am, I'm ready." She sat in the waiting room, praying her blouse would dry quickly, rehearsing her qualifications in her mind like a script she couldn't afford to forget. The other applicants looked polished, confident. One wore heels that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But Valerie clung to one truth. No one in that room had fought as hard to be there as she had. When her name was finally called, she walked into the panel room and was met by 3 stern faces. She greeted them with grace, but her eyes instinctively searched the space. She didn't know it yet, but someone else had read her resume earlier that morning, someone powerful. The questions came fast. Why did you leave your last job? How do you manage tasks under pressure? Can you use modern software tools? Valerie answered each one with calm confidence, lacing her responses with stories of past challenges and the systems she'd mastered. One of the panelists raised a brow. "And what drives you, Miss Obi?" Her answer came quietly but firmly. "My son," she said, voice unwavering. "He deserves to grow up knowing that strength can live in quiet places." By the end of the interview, they thanked her and promised to be in touch. As she stepped outside into the now drizzling afternoon, she didn't feel defeated. Soaked clothes, worn shoes, uncertain future, none of it mattered. She had shown up, fully. And that alone made her walk home with a small but unshakable sense of dignity. Valerie was sweeping the front of her apartment when she heard the shrill honk of a horn, followed by a burst of artificial laughter. Mildred stepped out of a white SUV parked inches from her doorstep, her high heels clacking against the cement like deliberate punctuation marks. She was dressed in a tight-fitting lemon blouse and tailored trousers, her makeup bold, and her perfume arriving before her words. "Oh, good," she said, waving a designer tote. "I brought some of Jesse's old shirts you might want to keep. You know, memories." Valerie blinked, stunned. "You came all this way for that?" Mildred gave a fake chuckle. "Well, we were passing through and I told him, let's stop by that old place your past used to live." Her gaze dropped to Valerie's slippers, then wandered across the porch where Clyde's school shoes were drying in the sun. "Still raising that boy on promises?" she added with a smirk. Valerie's hand clenched around the broom handle, but she refused to give Mildred the satisfaction of a reaction. Clyde came out, unaware of the tension, holding a drawing of a robot he'd made from torn notebook pages. "Mommy, look," he beamed. Mildred's brows lifted. "Aw, how? Creative. So that's the prodigy," she said sarcastically, glancing at the crayon-colored robot. Valerie knelt and took the drawing from Clyde with exaggerated care. "This is amazing, baby. We'll put it on the wall." Then she turned to Mildred. "If you came here to feel superior, I hope you've gathered enough material." Mildred tilted her head. "Valerie, don't be sensitive. I just think it's tragic, living off stale dreams while Jesse builds a future." Valerie gave a cold smile. "Tell Jesse that even rot can pretend to be perfume, but the scent never lasts." She took the bag from Mildred and placed it on the ground beside the gate. "You can leave now." As Mildred walked back to the car, visibly rattled by Valerie's composure, Valerie held Clyde tightly. She didn't cry. Not that day. Some wounds no longer bled. They just strengthened resolve. That night, after their dinner of yam porridge and boiled eggs, Clyde curled up beside Valerie on the old couch, his little body warm against hers. The lights flickered. Nipa had threatened disconnection again, but it was the kind of quiet evening Valerie had learned to cherish. Clyde stared up at the cracked ceiling for a long time before he spoke. "Mommy, in school, everyone talks about their dads. Am I supposed to have one?" His voice wasn't accusatory, just curious. The question made her chest tighten, as if the air had grown too thick to breathe. She put her arm around him and pulled him closer. "Every child comes into the world in their own way," she began carefully. "Some children live with both parents. Some live with one. But what really matters is love. That's what makes a family." Clyde was silent for a moment, then asked, "But did I ever have a dad, like before?" Valerie looked down at him, her heart aching. "Yes, baby, once. But he didn't know how to love properly, so he walked away. Not because of you, never because of you." Clyde's small fingers found hers. "Do you think he'll come back someday?" he whispered. Valerie stared ahead, her eyes burning. "No, sweetheart, and that's okay. Because people who walk away from love never find the way back to it." Clyde thought about that, then nodded. "Then you're my everything. You in this house and our fried eggs." She laughed softly and kissed his forehead. "And you are my whole world, even if I had nothing else." He yawned and drifted off to sleep in her arms, but Valerie sat awake for a while longer. His question had scratched at an old scar, but it also reignited a fire. She wouldn't let Clyde grow up defining himself by the absence of a man who chose shame over fatherhood. One day, her son's story would begin with triumph, not abandonment, and when that day came, Clyde wouldn't have to ask about his worth. The world would see it for themselves. The following Monday, Valerie was scrubbing the bathroom tiles when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. With cautious hope, she dried her hands and answered. "Hello." A polished female voice replied, "Good morning. Is this Miss Valerie Obi?" Her heart jumped. Yes, speaking. This is Miriam from D'Souza Global. We'd like to invite you for a second interview tomorrow at 10 a.m. for a different position, executive office support. Valerie nearly dropped the phone. Really? Thank you, I'll be there. After ending the call, she sat on the edge of her mattress in stunned silence. Something about the woman's tone hinted that this wasn't a routine callback. She quickly began preparing her best blouse and skirt, running stitches through the torn hem with renewed purpose. That job didn't just represent money, it was an opportunity to reclaim her dignity, to rewrite the story Jesse and Mildred had tried to stain. The next morning, she arrived early. The secretary led her through quiet hallways, lined with framed success stories and modern art. When the door to the executive floor opened, Valerie stepped into a sunlit office with floor-to-ceiling windows, and froze. Behind the wide glass desk stood a tall man in a charcoal gray suit, his presence calm but commanding. He turned and offered a warm smile. "Miss Obi, welcome. I'm Lauren D'Souza." Her lips parted slightly in surprise. She hadn't expected the CEO himself to be conducting her interview. "Thank you, sir. I wasn't told it would be you. I requested it personally," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Your file caught my attention. Your resilience, it stood out." Valerie sat slowly, unsure whether to feel flattered or nervous. "Tell me about yourself," he said, his voice gentle but steady. And so, with her hands folded neatly in her lap, Valerie began to speak, not just about her work history, but about the silent strength that had kept her standing. She didn't realize it yet, but the man across from her wasn't just interviewing a candidate. He was meeting someone who would change his life. Valerie had been through interviews before, but nothing had ever felt like this, calm, almost personal. Lauren D'Souza didn't bombard her with cold, technical questions. Instead, he listened, really listened. His eyes didn't flick to his phone or the clock. He asked, "What was the hardest challenge you faced in the last 5 years, and how did you overcome it?" Valerie hesitated at first, fingers nervously interlocked on her lap. Then something in his tone disarmed her. "Raising a son alone with no stable job," she replied quietly, "while trying not to let bitterness poison my spirit." Lauren's gaze softened. "That's a powerful answer," he said. He leaned back slightly. "You've done clerical work before, but this role will require discretion, long hours, and trust. Why should I believe you're the right fit?" Valerie looked him in the eye for the first time. "Because when life demanded strength from me, I didn't just survive, I grew sharper. I don't run from difficulty, I organize it." There was a brief pause before Lauren smiled slightly, tapping his pen against his notepad. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, hands in his pockets. "I'll be honest, Miss Obi. I've met graduates from Ivy League schools who couldn't speak with half the clarity you just did." Valerie blinked, unsure whether it was a compliment or a test. He turned to her again. "You weren't called here by mistake. I reviewed the first interview panel's notes and asked that you be considered for a position directly under my office." Valerie's lips parted, stunned. "Why?" Lauren tilted his head. "Because I know what strength looks like when it's dressed in silence." Before she left, he added gently, "Take care of yourself and your son. That part in your file stayed with me." Walking out of the building, Valerie felt dazed, not from nerves, but from hope. The way Lauren looked at her wasn't pitying. It was respectful. For the first time in years, someone had seen her not as a struggling mother, but as a woman with value. And that single shift in perspective lit a match somewhere deep inside her. 2 days later, the official offer letter arrived. Valerie sat on her bed rereading the lines over and over, her hands trembling slightly. The salary wasn't extravagant, but it was steady, respectable, enough to breathe, enough to plan. And the job title, Executive Office Support to the CEO, felt like a name badge to a new beginning. Clyde noticed the excitement on her face and crawled onto the bed beside her. "Is it a good letter, Mommy?" She nodded slowly. "It's the kind that tells you the hard days are starting to pay off." Clyde grinned and hugged her. "Does it mean we can get bread and eggs on school days now?" She laughed, her eyes moist. "Yes, baby. It means we won't have to pick between one or the other anymore." The thought filled her with a quiet kind of joy. Not the loud, jumping up and down kind, but the deep, sacred kind that comes when light cracks through after a long stretch of darkness. When she resumed work the following Monday, she was met with polite curiosity from other staff, some warm, some distant. Lauren, however, kept his demeanor professional, yet there was something about his calm acknowledgement of her presence that steadied her nerves. After a brief orientation, he called her into his office again. "I expect honesty, punctuality, and confidentiality," he said. "But I'm also aware that you're a mother. If ever you need to step out for your son, just let me know. I understand that life doesn't stop for corporate schedules." Valerie blinked. "Thank you. Sir, that means a lot." He nodded once. "Also, call me Lauren. Titles get in the way of real work." The rest of the day was quiet, and she threw herself into organizing files, typing reports, and learning the rhythm of an environment far removed from her past. That night, after putting Clyde to bed, she sat by the window and whispered to herself, "Don't mess this up. This is more than a job. It's your rebirth." And deep inside, she knew it was also the start of a connection she didn't yet fully understand. Weeks passed, and Valerie began to settle into her role like second skin. She learned to anticipate Lauren's preferences, how he liked his coffee dark and silent in the mornings, how he edited memos 3 times before signing, how he never raised his voice, even in tension. It intrigued her, the calm power he carried. One Thursday afternoon, as she filed reports into labeled envelopes, his voice came from the doorway. "Valerie, we're hosting a company dinner this Saturday evening. You're invited." She looked up, surprised. "Oh, I don't usually attend such things, sir." Lauren crossed his arms casually. "You work directly under my office. It's less of an invite, more of an inclusion." She hesitated. "I don't really have the kind of clothes people wear to places like that." He paused, then said softly, "Come as you are. The invitation is about presence, not fashion." Then he left without waiting for her answer. That Saturday, Valerie stood in front of her small mirror wearing a cream-colored blouse and black skirt, the best combination she could find. But after staring at herself for 5 minutes, she changed into her regular wear and stayed home. Clyde sat beside her as she spooned rice into his bowl. "You're not going to the party?" he asked. "No, love. I decided we'll have our own party." She turned on their Bluetooth speaker and played Clyde's favorite song. Later that evening, as Clyde colored by candlelight, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a neatly wrapped box with no sender name. Inside was a Lego robot set with a card that simply read, "For Clyde. Every child should feel celebrated. Elle." Valerie stared at the handwriting for a long time. She had no proof, but she knew. Lauren hadn't just noticed her work ethic. He'd noticed her life, and he was choosing, quietly, to honor it. Something in her chest tightened, not out of romance, but recognition. She had spent years invisible, and now someone was seeing her without even asking her to shine. Jesse strolled through the polished glass doors of D'Souza Global with the swagger of a man convinced the universe owed him applause. He had just landed a mid-level marketing strategist role through a mutual connection who'd owed him a favor. The irony, he didn't even know who owned the company. His only concern was the pay, the title, and the new status it granted him over beers with his friends. On his first day, he wore a navy blue blazer with gold buttons and aviator shades he refused to remove until he was halfway into the building. "This is it," he whispered to himself. "New job, new rank, new life." His arrogance filled the lobby like smoke. When introduced to his team, he nodded casually and made offhand comments like, "Let's just say I've worked with real firms before." The junior staff exchanged silent glances. Something about him felt performative. Across the building, Valerie was working late sorting logistics for an upcoming executive summit. She had no idea Jesse had been hired yet. The company was large, and she rarely interacted with the marketing division. But that evening, as she dropped off files at the central print station, she heard his voice. It stopped her mid-step, that laugh, that smug rhythm. She turned a corner cautiously and saw him laughing near the elevator, flanked by 2 junior marketers. Her heart stalled. "Jesse here, in this building." Her mind reeled. Did he know she worked here too? Should she say something to HR? No, not yet. She needed to process this. As she quietly slipped away, She didn't notice Lauren watching from a hallway nearby. His eyes narrowed, sensing the shift in her body language. Back at her desk, Valerie closed her eyes and whispered, "This can't be real." It was as though the past had walked into her sanctuary wearing a tie. But this time, she wouldn't be blindsided. Not again. The following week brought a surprise. Clyde had been shortlisted for a competitive spot in a prestigious private school near the city center. Valerie had applied weeks earlier on a whim after overhearing two executives discussing it in the elevator. She'd filled out the application late at night, fully aware she couldn't afford the fees. But she had submitted it anyway, driven by a mother's audacity. Now, sitting in the school's admissions office, she could barely hold her breath as the administrator read through the paperwork. "Your son shows exceptional potential," the woman said, adjusting her glasses. "We have a partial scholarship available. However, the first term fees will still need to be covered in advance." Valerie nodded slowly, masking the twist in her gut. "How much?" When she heard the amount, her breath caught. It was double what she earned in a month. Still, she thanked the woman and promised to get back soon. As she stepped out into the sunlit courtyard, Clyde ran ahead, already imagining himself on the playground. She smiled for him, even as a storm gathered quietly in her thoughts. 2 days later, Lauren called her into his office. "I reviewed your calendar. You've been working beyond your scheduled hours." "That hasn't gone unnoticed," he said casually. "Thank you, sir," she replied. "I'm just doing my best." He tapped a file on his desk. "Also, I received a letter from Crown Hill Academy." Valerie's spine straightened. "They sent it here?" Lauren nodded. "They CC'd me because of the reference line you listed, Supervisor L. D'Souza." He studied her. "You didn't mention it." She lowered her eyes. "I didn't want to seem like I was using connections for personal gain." There was a pause. Then he slid an envelope toward her. "The first term has been paid anonymously. Accept it as acknowledgement, not pity." Valerie's hands trembled as she reached for it. "Why? Why would you do this?" Lauren's voice was quiet. "Because some children deserve to walk into doors their mothers never had the chance to knock on." And for the first time in years, Valerie wept not from pain, but from the overwhelming kindness of being seen. The quarterly strategy meeting had drawn top-level staff from every department into the high-rise's glossy conference room. Jesse arrived 10 minutes late, sauntering in with a half-buttoned shirt and a smug apology. "Traffic was a beast, you know how Lagos can be," he muttered, sliding into a chair and nodding at a few familiar faces. The room was filled with executives, managers, and coordinators, all seated around a long oval table with sleek portfolios and tablets in hand. Jesse barely glanced at the agenda. He was more focused on who he could impress. But then the glass doors opened again, and Lauren entered, followed closely by Valerie, who carried a set of updated project files for distribution. Jesse was mid-sentence when his eyes landed on her. His smirk froze, his back stiffened. Valerie, poised and unreadable, handed him a copy of the printouts like he was a stranger. "Thank you," he mumbled, bewildered. His eyes darted from her to Lauren, who took the seat at the head of the table. The room settled, and Lauren began outlining performance objectives, but Jesse barely heard a word. What is she doing here? Working directly under him? His pride began to crumble in real time. Valerie didn't glance at him once. She stood calmly beside Lauren's chair, flipping through notes, her demeanor composed, professional. Jesse squirmed in his seat, suddenly aware of the distance between the man he used to mock and the woman he'd dismissed. "Valerie," Lauren said mid-presentation, "could you pull up the forecast report?" She nodded, stepped forward, and spoke with such confidence and precision that even the most senior executives listened. Jesse's jaw tightened. She wasn't the same woman he'd laughed at outside a market. And what disturbed him more wasn't just that she had risen. It was that she had done it without ever needing him. And that fact, though unspoken, echoed louder in that meeting room than any spreadsheet ever could. Mildred was not one to ignore discomfort, especially when it scratched at her vanity. Jesse had returned home unusually quiet after the company's quarterly meeting. His mood shifted from arrogance to suspicion, pacing the living room like a man trying to solve a riddle. When Mildred asked what was wrong, he muttered something about Valerie, suddenly working in close proximity to the CEO. That single phrase ignited Mildred's paranoia. You mean the same Valerie who used to beg you for baby clothes? Now she's suddenly executive material? She hissed, arms folded. Jessie nodded bitterly. She walked into that meeting like she owned the floor. And D'Souza, he listens to her, like she's someone. Mildred's eyes narrowed. She wasn't about to let a woman she'd once mocked be the object of admiration, especially not in elite spaces she herself hadn't accessed. The next day, she called one of her cousins who worked in HR at a partner firm and whispered speculation into the phone like venom. Valerie? She's just smart enough to know how to climb using the right man. Believe me, that position didn't come from competence. Within a week, whispers began trickling through D'Souza Global's halls. Some coworkers suddenly became cool toward Valerie. Side eyes in the break room. Muffled laughs when she walked by. One afternoon, she found her desk slightly shifted, her files rearranged. Though no one said it aloud, the message was clear: someone was sowing seeds. When Lauren asked during a routine check-in if everything was all right, she forced a smile and said, "Nothing I can't handle." But that night, at home, she stared into her mirror for a long time. "I won't give them what they want," she said aloud. "I've swallowed worse." Still, the ache gnawed at her. What hurt most wasn't the rumors. It was how quickly people were willing to believe the worst of a woman once they saw her standing too tall. She didn't owe them humility to ease their discomfort, but she knew the battle had silently changed. And the only way to win now was to outgrow the noise without letting it touch her dignity. Late one Saturday afternoon, Valerie was rinsing vegetables in a basin outside when she noticed a black car slowly navigating her dusty street. She frowned, standing up to get a better view as it parked near Mama Tenny's house. The driver stepped out and walked to the rear door, opening it, and Lauren D'Souza emerged, dressed in a simple black polo and jeans. Valerie's heart skipped. He looked impossibly out of place amidst the sagging roofs and rusted zinc fences, yet he didn't flinch. Clyde, who had been drawing chalk shapes on the ground, looked up. "Mommy, that's your Oga," he whispered excitedly. Lauren approached with a small paper bag in hand. "I was nearby for a real estate inspection," he said. "Thought I'd stop by and see how the school transition is going for Clyde." Valerie wiped her hands on a rag. "You came all the way here, personally?" He glanced around. "Is it a problem?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it's just unexpected." Clyde took the bag and peered inside. "Roasted corn," he squealed. Lauren smiled. "The woman down the road sells it fresh." I asked which one had less pepper, figured I'd better learn the local tricks. Valerie found herself laughing, genuine, soft laughter she hadn't heard from herself in weeks. They sat outside on a bench, the sky amber with early evening light. Lauren listened as Clyde spoke about his new classmates and how he was now part of the spelling bee team. "He memorized 12 new words last night," Valerie said proudly. Lauren turned to her. "You're doing an extraordinary job, Valerie. I hope you know that." Her expression faltered, caught off guard by the sincerity. "Some days, I'm just doing what I can." He nodded. "And that's what makes it remarkable." As he left, Clyde waved enthusiastically, roasted corn in one hand. Valerie watched the car disappear down the street and felt something strange, like peace brushing against hope. Not romance, not fantasy, just the rare warmth of being valued without condition. It was the end of another busy school day, and the playground buzzed with laughter, children racing in every direction as parents gathered near the gates. Valerie stood quietly among them, waiting for Clyde, when she heard a familiar voice that made her stomach knot. "Well, well," Jessie muttered loudly enough for a few nearby mothers to turn. "Still picking him up yourself?" Mildred, by his side in a tight outfit that screamed attention, added mockingly, "Oh, wait, that's right, there's no daddy to do the honors." The words were sharp, slicing through the quiet hum of the crowd. Valerie turned slowly, her eyes cold. "You've had 6 years to stay out of our lives, Jessie. Why choose now to show up and spit poison?" He smirked. "Just calling things as they are. Some of us know how to raise complete families." Clyde came running up at that exact moment, backpack swinging on his shoulders. He froze, sensing tension. Jessie looked him over, scoffing. "Poor kid doesn't even know he's just a mistake you kept." A gasp escaped from one of the mothers nearby. Clyde looked up at Valerie, confused, wounded. "Mommy, what is he saying?" Valerie crouched to his level, eyes welling. "Nothing, baby. He's just someone who doesn't know how to love." Jesse opened his mouth to speak again, but this time another voice cut through. "That's enough," said one of the school staff. "This is a learning environment. You're upsetting the children." Jesse scoffed and stormed off, dragging Mildred behind him. Valerie stood, holding Clyde tightly, shielding his small body from the whispers. That evening at home, Clyde asked softly, "Am I really the mistake?" Her voice cracked as she answered, "No, baby. You're the one thing in my life that makes everything else worth it." But as she lay awake long after Clyde had fallen asleep, tears soaked her pillow. It wasn't the insult that broke her. It was the fact that Clyde now carried the stain of Jesse's cruelty in his memory, and that she could never forgive. The next morning, Valerie didn't go to work. She couldn't. Her body felt physically present, but her spirit was somewhere else, stuck at the school gate, reliving the way Clyde had looked at her, eyes searching for answers she didn't know how to give. She called in sick for the first time since being hired and spent the day cleaning, folding clothes, and preparing a lunch Clyde never really touched. Meanwhile, at D'Souza Global, Lauren noticed her absence. By noon, he requested a full report from HR and frowned at the vague personal emergency note. Later that evening, he called her directly. "Valerie, I noticed you didn't come in today," he said calmly. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated. I couldn't face the day. Something happened at my son's school. Jesse and his partner showed up. They humiliated him in front of other parents. There was a long silence. Then Lauren's voice dropped to a tone she'd never heard before, ice cold and deliberate. "Jesse Adwale? The new hire in marketing?" She swallowed. "Yes." He didn't speak again, but Valerie could almost feel the shift through the phone. After ending the call, Lauren sat at his desk in stillness. Rage wasn't his usual language, but this crossed a line he couldn't unsee. He pulled up Jesse's employee record and scrolled through performance notes with tightening fists. Then, quietly, he dialed his legal advisor. "I need a full audit on Jesse Adwale's hiring process, references, and any complaints, verbal or documented. Discretion is key." That night, Valerie received a text from Lauren. "Take tomorrow off, too. Spend it with Clyde. I'll handle what needs to be handled." She stared at the message for a long time before locking her phone and curling beside her son. He was already asleep, but she whispered to him anyway. "You won't be treated like that again. I promise you." What Valerie didn't know was that Lauren's sense of justice was surgical, quiet, exact, and always followed through. By the following Monday, the office air was tense. The quiet buzz moved from cubicle to corridor. Something was happening. Team leads were called into private meetings. Jesse was summoned last. He walked into the executive conference room, still unaware of what awaited him. Lauren sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Mr. Adwale," he began, voice cool, "I have reviewed your file. It seems several inconsistencies have come to light, specifically falsified claims about your prior roles, inflated metrics, and questionable recommendations." Jesse's smirk faded. "Sir, Lauren raised a hand. Let me finish." He slid a folder toward Jesse. "As of this morning, your access to company systems has been suspended pending further review. Until we conclude our internal audit, you are relieved of all responsibilities." Jesse looked stunned. "But I've been hitting targets." "Manipulated ones," Lauren replied, standing. "This organization doesn't tolerate fraud or intimidation inside or outside our walls." Outside the glass doors, Valerie had returned to work and resumed her duties with quiet focus. She hadn't asked for justice, but somehow it had come knocking on her behalf. When she passed by the marketing floor, she noticed Jesse's desk being cleared out. One of the admin staff whispered, "They said he might be fired." Something about falsifying credentials. Valerie didn't flinch. She simply walked back to her department, logged in, and began typing up minutes from last week's meeting. Later that evening, Lauren caught her as she was exiting the building. "I said I'd handle it," he said softly. She nodded. "You did more than that." There was no celebration in her tone, just quiet affirmation. "The world needs more men who stand where others stay silent," she added. Lauren looked at her, then gently replied, "And it needs more women who rise even when they have no ladder." Their eyes held for a moment, one not colored by romance, but mutual respect. It was the beginning of something purer, trust that was earned, not bought. The auditorium was filled with color and energy as parents, teachers, and students gathered for the term-end parent-child celebration day. Clyde had been selected to recite a short poem on stage, a tribute to mothers. Valerie sat in the middle row, her heart drumming with anticipation, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, ready to record every moment. When Clyde's name was called, she held her breath. He walked to the microphone in his school uniform, a little crooked tie and all, his paper trembling slightly in his grip. Then he began, "My mom is strong, like thunder wrapped in a smile. She makes rice taste like hugs and knows how to chase monsters from under my bed. She's my umbrella when things are too loud." The audience chuckled warmly. Valerie's eyes filled. Clyde ended with a line that quieted the room. "She never had a sword, but she still fought for me." The applause that followed felt like the universe confirming what she had always known but never heard aloud. She was enough. After the event, parents mingled around tables decorated with cupcakes and juice boxes. Clyde ran toward her, arms outstretched. "Did I do okay?" he asked breathlessly. "You were perfect," she whispered, hugging him tight. Just then, Lauren approached, blending in casually with the crowd. He wore a simple button-down shirt and offered Clyde a firm handshake. "You made your mother very proud today," he said with a smile. "Thank you, sir," Clyde beamed. Valerie watched the exchange silently, something warm tugging at her chest. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," Lauren replied, "but some things are too important to miss." As they stood in the sunshine together, watching Clyde run off toward his classmates, Valerie realized this was more than just a job, more than just recovery. It was the quiet unfolding of something redemptive, her son being celebrated, not pitied. And for the first time, she felt the sting of the past being slowly overwritten by something beautiful and new. The community fair was meant to be a day of laughter, music, and shared joy. Children darted between booths holding balloons and candy floss, while parents mingled beneath canopies draped with colored ribbons. Valerie stood near the arts and crafts section, helping Clyde finish his clay model of a lion, when she heard the unmistakable cackle that twisted her stomach. Mildred. And next to her, of course, was Jessie, wearing dark shades and an overinflated sense of entitlement. They weren't part of the fair. They had merely come to flaunt. "Well, if it isn't the Madonna herself," Mildred sneered as she walked up. "Still parading the boy like he's a trophy for your mistakes?" Valerie froze, shielding Clyde with her body. Jessie added, "Honestly, this whole event screams mediocrity. You people clap for scraps and call it success." A few parents turned at the rising volume, eyes narrowing. "Don't," Valerie said quietly. "Not here. Not in front of my son." Mildred tilted her head. "Sweetheart, the world already knows. He's a bastard, and no Rolls-Royce will wash that away." The laughter that followed didn't just come from them. It came from a few others in the crowd who didn't know better, who enjoyed drama more than decency. Clyde's clay figure fell from his hand and shattered. His bottom lip trembled. "Mommy, can we go?" he whispered. Before Valerie could respond, a woman nearby with a baby on her hip pulled out her phone. "I'm recording this. Let's see how bold you are when this hits the internet." Mildred's smile faltered, but Jessie scoffed. "Do it. Truth doesn't need makeup." Another mother stepped forward. "You're not welcome here. You humiliated a child and called it pride." As more voices rose in defense of Valerie, she took Clyde's hand and led him away. But the damage had been done. Clyde's eyes were red with humiliation, and Valerie's throat burned with swallowed screams. That night, as she held her son close, she whispered, "Let them laugh today. Because the next time we're seen, it will be for reasons they'll never be able to mock." The following week, the video from the fair exploded across social media. Man publicly shames child, gets unexpected reaction, and it spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up, influencers reposted it, and strangers began flooding the comment sections in defense of Valerie and Clyde. But Jessie and Mildred remained silent, perhaps believing the noise would pass. What they didn't know was that the next confrontation would not come in the form of a tweet. It would come face to face. At another school event days later, parents gathered again, this time for an outdoor prize-giving ceremony. The air was crisp with anticipation. Clyde had been nominated for a creativity award. Valerie wore a simple dress, her braids pulled back neatly. She stood in the crowd, trying to focus, until she heard them again. Jesse and Mildred were back, laughing, loud. And then, just as someone handed Clyde his certificate and applause began, a low hum rolled through the air. A black Rolls-Royce pulled into the school's compound, sleek and gleaming under the sun. Every head turned. The driver stepped out, opened the back door, and out stepped Lauren D'Souza in a tailored black suit, his presence calm but commanding. He walked directly to Valerie and placed a gentle hand on Clyde's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his voice clear and deliberate. The crowd murmured, stunned. Jesse's eyes widened, confusion morphing into panic. "Son!" he spat. Lauren turned to him, eyes cool. "Yes, my legal son, my family." Murmurs erupted among parents. A mother whispered, "Isn't that the CEO of D'Souza Global?" Jesse stumbled backward. You never said." Lauren took a step closer. "You never asked. You assumed she had no one. And now the world knows who you insulted, who you belittled, is under my protection." Mildred went pale. The ground beneath them had shifted. What was meant to be another moment of shame had transformed into a declaration of legacy. The silence that followed Lauren's words was thunderous. The headmaster stammered through closing remarks, but no one was really listening. All eyes were on Valerie, Clyde, and the man beside them who had just claimed what another man had discarded. Jesse stepped forward, desperation flooding his voice. Wait, this is all dramatic. You don't even know the full story." Lauren tilted his head slightly. "Oh, but I do. I've read everything. From the day he left her pregnant to the moment he showed up at a child's school with enough cruelty to make a boy question his worth. You want credit now. For what? Breathing in the same space as your son and calling it fatherhood?" The crowd gasped. Jesse turned toward Valerie. "So this is your revenge?" he asked bitterly. "You replaced me?" Valerie's voice was steady. "You were never present to begin with. You can't replace what was never there." Lauren then crouched beside Clyde, looked him in the eye, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You are not a mistake. You are not a secret. You are mine. And I will stand beside you until you are tall enough to walk through every door I've opened." Clyde blinked up at him, a slow smile forming. For the first time, the boy's posture changed, shoulders square, head high. The crowd erupted into applause. Not out of politeness, but in recognition of a moment larger than itself. Jesse turned to leave, his face flushed with humiliation, while Mildred trailed after him without a word. As they disappeared through the gates, Lauren looked at Valerie. "I meant every word," she swallowed hard. "So did I, the day I decided my son would never be defined by someone else's silence." And just like that, the chapter closed, not with vengeance, but with vindication. 2 days after the school event, Jesse reported to work, still hoping the scandal had stayed outside corporate walls. He strutted into D'Souza Global, head high, ignoring the stares that followed him. But something was different. His access card didn't unlock the elevator to the executive floors. Security politely redirected him to a side conference room. Waiting there was Lauren, seated calmly at the head of the table with the HR director and a legal associate beside him. Jesse stepped in, confused. "Is this about the social media drama?" "That was personal. Doesn't concern my work." Lauren didn't raise his voice. "You've confused visibility with immunity." He opened a folder. "After a formal review, we've confirmed falsified documents in your application, unapproved use of departmental budgets, and multiple violations of our internal conduct code." Jesse's face paled. "But sir, I've brought in numbers." You brought disgrace," Lauren interrupted, standing. "You used this office to feed your ego, not serve this company." He paused, then added, voice low and final, "But the last straw wasn't numbers or policy. It was standing in public, mocking a child while wearing the name of a company I built with integrity." Jesse's breath hitched. "You're firing me." Over her, Lauren stepped closer. "I'm firing you because you don't deserve to represent anything I stand for. This isn't about Valerie. This is about the kind of man you are." Jesse turned to the HR director, panicked. This is emotional. It's personal. She calmly pushed forward a letter. It's official. Effective immediately. As Jesse was escorted out, Lauren remained still, watching without gloating. Back in his office, he opened his drawer, pulled out a photograph of Clyde from the school event, and placed it in his planner. Not as a symbol of revenge, but as a reminder that protecting people quietly, fiercely, and justly was the truest kind of leadership. By the end of the week, the news had reached every corner of the internet. CEO fires executive after public bullying of child. The headline led every blog, newspaper sidebar, and social commentary forum. Valerie hadn't anticipated the public reaction. Reporters tried to call, influencers posted think pieces, and even parents from Clyde's school reached out to express support. But inside their small apartment, nothing changed. The walls remained the same shade of fading cream, the rice cooked the same way, and bedtime stories were still read by flashlight when power flickered. Valerie stayed quiet through it all, not granting interviews or feeding the frenzy. She wanted peace, not fame. One evening, as she folded laundry, her neighbor, Mama Tenny, stopped by with a basket of fruit. People may not always say it, but what you've done. Standing with your head high through shame and praise alike, that's the kind of strength children remember forever. That night, Clyde crawled into her bed, holding a school flyer in his hand. "Mommy, they want me to write a short story for the school magazine, about someone who changed my life." She smiled, brushing hair from his eyes. "What will you write?" He grinned. "About you, and Mr. Lauren too, but mostly you." Her eyes welled. "You sure?" He nodded. "Because you never gave up, even when it looked like we were losing." She kissed his forehead. "Then write your truth, baby." Across town, Lauren sat in his private study, quietly declining all interview requests. When his communications manager asked if he wanted to clarify anything publicly, he replied, "No. The truth doesn't need to shout when it's standing tall." As the world buzzed, both he and Valerie stayed grounded. Because healing wasn't found in headlines, it lived in whispered bedtime stories, quiet cups of tea, and the safe silence of dignity restored. The weekend was slow and calm. Clyde and Valerie sat beneath the mango tree near their compound, eating boiled corn and playing word games. It was the kind of moment that used to feel out of reach, a full belly, soft breeze, no tension hanging in the air. Clyde looked thoughtful as he chewed. "Mommy?" She glanced at him. He hesitated, then asked, "Back then, when I asked about my dad, did it hurt you to answer?" Valerie smiled gently, wiping his chin with a napkin. "Yes, baby. Not because of the question, but because I wanted to protect you from a pain I hadn't even learned how to name." Clyde nodded slowly, staring at the sunlight between the leaves. "I think I understand now. I don't need him. I never really did." She took a deep breath. "You're strong, Clyde, and loved. You've always been both." He leaned his head on her shoulder. "Can I still call Mr. Lauren my dad someday?" Her heart swelled and trembled all at once. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she held him close and whispered, "What matters most is who shows up, who stays, and who loves without condition. If that's what you feel, then yes, you can call him anything your heart trusts." Later that night, Clyde handed her a drawing, 3 figures standing beneath a rainbow, one holding a briefcase, the other 2 smiling wide. At the top he had written, "My family." Valerie sat on the edge of the bed staring at the paper, unable to stop the tears from falling. Not of sorrow, but of awe. She had carried this child through storms, insults, loneliness, and yet here he was, whole, joyful, proud. As she kissed him goodnight, she said quietly, "I used to think I was raising you alone, but now I see you were raising me too." And in that sacred stillness, she knew the past had finally loosened its grip. The sun was soft and golden as it streamed through the garden trees behind a modest, white-painted home in a quieter part of town. Valerie stood in a sleeveless blue dress, her braids tied back, watching as Clyde chased a paper plane across the lawn. In the months that followed the scandal, life had not become perfect, but it had become peaceful. Lauren had bought the house quietly, no fanfare, no grand gestures. "It's not a reward," he had told her, "it's a reset." They hadn't rushed labels. There were no announcements, no dramatic proposals. What had grown between them was built gently, on trust, on presence, on quiet cups of tea shared over weekend reports. Clyde had grown taller, more confident. He laughed louder. He asked fewer questions about the past and more about dreams. That morning, Lauren had arrived with a tripod and said simply, "We're taking a photo today. One to frame, one to remember." They set up under the mango tree. Clyde sat between them, arms wrapped around both Valerie and Lauren, his gap-toothed grin infectious. "Say legacy," Lauren called out just before the timer clicked. The shutter snapped, and in that moment everything stilled, three souls bound not by bloodlines or contracts, but by choice. Valerie looked at the photo and smiled. "We don't look perfect," she said. "We look real," Lauren nodded. "That's all I ever wanted." Later, as they sat down to eat, Clyde announced he was writing a poem titled "The Man Who Didn't Run." Valerie raised a brow. "For who?" Clyde beamed. "Both of you, because one stayed and one arrived. And now I've got everything." That night, as the framed photo found its place on the living room wall, Valerie whispered a prayer of thanks, not for wealth, not even for the justice they'd seen, but for love that had been quiet, healing, and finally, whole. Years passed and the seasons shifted. Clyde grew into a thoughtful teenager with a steady gaze and the heart of a writer. His notebooks were filled with sketches, short stories, and quiet reflections that blended memory with meaning. On the day he turned 18, he stood in front of a small but packed auditorium holding a book, his first published work, titled "The Man Who Called Me Son." It wasn't a biography. It was a journey, a tapestry woven from moments of pain, healing, laughter, and silent strength. The final chapter read, "He didn't make me. He didn't owe me, but he saw me, and when he did, I became whole." In the front row, Valerie held Lauren's hand tightly, her eyes swimming with tears. The applause roared around them, but she heard only one voice, that of her son, sharing their truth without shame. Later, when reporters asked what inspired the book, Clyde smiled and said, "My mother," and a man who walked in, not to replace, but to stay. After the event, Valerie found a quiet spot near the back lawn of the venue, staring up at the stars. Clyde approached and sat beside her. "You proud of me?" he asked softly. She turned to him, barely able to speak. "You've always made me proud, but today, you made me healed." He rested his head on her shoulder. "You were always enough, Mom. I just wanted the world to know it." A few feet away, Lauren watched them from a respectful distance before walking up and joining them. No words were exchanged for a while, just hands held, memories shared through glances. In a world obsessed with loud endings and grand finales, their story had become something rarer, proof that healing doesn't need noise. Just truth, just love. And when Clyde later wrote the dedication for his second book, he kept it simple. "For the woman who showed me strength, and the man who never let me forget it." Here's the Bible verse, Psalm 147, verse 3. "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." Reflection. Just as God restores what the world has bruised, Valerie's story is a testimony of divine healing through unexpected love, quiet justice, and the rebuilding of dignity. Her scars did not disqualify her. They qualified her for a deeper, more lasting form of joy. Moral of the story. Your worth is never defined by those who abandon you, but by those who choose to love you despite the wreckage they didn't cause. This story teaches that the greatest revenge is healing. True strength lies not in retaliation, but in rising with grace. Valerie didn't fight back with bitterness. She endured, rebuilt, and allowed truth to speak louder than humiliation. In the end, legacy isn't written by those who walk away, but by those who stay, love, and uplift in silence. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.